In 1907, a peculiar phenomenon began to unfold at a hospital in Kyoto, Japan, one that would confound the medical community and remain a mystery for decades. This was not a case of a rare disease or an unexplained medical condition, but something far more disturbing and inexplicable. A group of patients, all from different walks of life and unrelated in every conceivable way, began experiencing identical nightmares. These were not ordinary dreams. These were vivid, chilling, and deeply unsettling visions that left the patients profoundly disturbed. They all saw the same terrifying images, felt the same overwhelming dread, and awoke with a sense of shared, inexplicable horror. What was happening in that hospital wing, and why was it so uniquely disturbing? The unsettling nature of this case lies not just in the fact that the patient shared similar dreams, but in the fact that those dreams seemed to be more than just random occurrences. They were too synchronized, too precise, and too filled with meaning to be easily dismissed as a coincidence. Each patient, from the elderly to the young, from the healthy to the critically ill, reported being drawn into a strange, otherworldly place in their sleep, where they encountered figures and symbols that seemed to have a life of their own. Some of them described scenes of dark landscapes, haunted forests, or shadowy figures that lurked just out of sight. Others spoke of an ancient presence, a sense of something ancient and malevolent watching them as they slept. What was most striking, however, was the consistency with which these patients described their experiences. They saw the same faces, the same symbols, and the same eerie landscapes. The dreams were not simply similar, they were identical. In a time when sleep disorders were barely understood, let alone studied in depth, this raised serious questions. Could something about the hospital itself be responsible for this phenomenon? Was there an environmental factor, something in the air or in the structure of the building, that was triggering these shared dreams? Or could it be that the human mind was capable of something far more mysterious and sinister, something that defied explanation? At the time, Japan was in the midst of a cultural and scientific transformation. The Meiji Restoration had led to rapid modernization, and Western influences were shaping the fields of medicine, psychology, and science. However, despite these advances, Japan was still deeply rooted in ancient traditions and beliefs. The supernatural had not yet been fully replaced by scientific understanding, and many of the local people still adhered to old customs, rituals, and beliefs in spirits, curses, and the afterlife. This mixture of modern science and ancient superstition created an environment ripe for strange occurrences like the one unfolding in Kyoto. For some, the idea that the shared nightmares were the result of a curse, a vengeful spirit, or an ancient force beyond human comprehension was not so far-fetched. The hospital itself was located in a part of Kyoto that had long been associated with the supernatural. There were old legends about the land on which the hospital had been built, stories of spirits who haunted the area and of strange events that had taken place over the centuries. In the minds of many, the possibility that the shared nightmares were linked to these ancient stories was not out of the question. Were the patients merely susceptible to suggestion, influenced by the collective consciousness of their fellow sufferers? Or was there something more profound happening in that hospital wing, something that could not be explained by conventional science? As the days turned into weeks and more patients began to report similar experiences, the hospital staff grew increasingly concerned. Some of the doctors initially dismissed the accounts as mere coincidence or the result of stress and illness. However, as the phenomenon spread, even the most skeptical among them were forced to confront the reality that something far stranger was at play. There was no logical explanation for what was happening, and the more they delved into the case, the more baffling it became. The patients were not merely experiencing strange dreams, they were undergoing something that seemed to have a physical and psychological toll. Many of them awoke from their nightmares in a state of extreme distress, sweating, shaking, and disoriented. Some even reported feeling a lingering sense of dread after they woke up, as if the nightmares had somehow followed them into their waking lives. These were not just vivid dreams, they were life-altering experiences that seemed to bleed into reality. For the doctors, this posed a serious challenge. What was causing this? Was it an environmental factor, a chemical or toxin in the air? Was it a psychological phenomenon, a form of mass hysteria that was spreading among the patients like wildfire? Or was there something else, something far more sinister, at work? As the mystery deepened, the hospital administrators were forced to take action. They moved patients from the affected wing to other parts of the hospital, hoping that this might alleviate the problem. But to their surprise, even those who had been relocated continued to experience the same nightmares. It was as though the very act of being in the hospital had somehow imprinted this shared experience into their minds. The doctors were left scrambling for answers, but no matter how hard they searched, no clear explanation emerged. They turned to local folklore, seeking answers in ancient beliefs and spiritual traditions, but even this failed to provide any clarity. The media soon caught wind of the story, and it didn't take long for the reports of the mysterious nightmares to spread throughout Kyoto and beyond. The strange phenomenon became the talk of the town, with people speculating about the cause of the shared dreams. Some believed the hospital was cursed, while others thought it might be a sign of something darker, a warning from the spirit world. As the number of affected patients grew, so too did the number of theories. Some even suggested that the nightmares were the result of a secret experiment being conducted in the hospital, one that had gone horribly wrong. The more the public became involved, the more the mystery seemed to grow, until it took on a life of its own. The phenomenon eventually faded from public view as the years went by, but the legacy of those shared nightmares lingered. The hospital wing was closed, and the patients who had been affected by the nightmares were never the same. Some of them were left with lingering psychological scars, unable to shake the haunting memories of the dreams that had once plagued them. Others, however, reported that the nightmares simply stopped as mysteriously as they had begun. There were no more reports of similar occurrences, and the case was eventually swept under the rug, left to gather dust in the archives of history. But for those who had been there, the experience remained a vivid, terrifying memory, one that could never be fully explained. To this day, the cause of those shared nightmares remains a mystery. Was it a psychological phenomenon, a product of the mind's deep and unfathomable recesses? Was it an environmental factor, a chemical or physical agent that triggered the dreams? Or was it something more inexplicable, something that transcended the boundaries of science and entered the realm of the supernatural? The answers remain elusive, and the story of the Kyoto hospital wing continues to haunt those who dare to ask the question, what truly happened in that dark corner of the world? In 1907, Kyoto was a city at the crossroads of tradition and change. A city where the old and the new existed side by side, where centuries-old temples stood alongside Western-style buildings and railways that were rapidly transforming the landscape. Japan, having recently emerged from the feudal era, was undergoing one of the most profound periods of modernization in its history. The Meiji Restoration had swept away centuries of isolation and opened the door to new technologies, new ways of thinking, and new influences from the West. Medicine was no exception to this transformation. As Japan embraced Western scientific methods, the old ways of healing were slowly being replaced by new medical practices that were based on observation, diagnosis, and technology. Yet, despite this rapid progress, many traditional beliefs still held sway over the minds of the people. Kyoto, once the capital of Japan, was still considered the cultural heart of the nation, steeped in the ancient customs, rituals, and beliefs of Shinto and Buddhism. It was a city where superstitions and folk stories were interwoven with daily life. People still believed in the power of spirits, ghosts, and ancestral gods, forces that were thought to shape both the natural and supernatural worlds. While doctors and scientists in Kyoto were eager to adopt Western medical practices, many ordinary people still turned to the wisdom of shamans, herbalists, and spiritual healers when faced with illness or misfortune. The city's very air seemed charged with this mixture of the rational and the mystical, a place where the lines between the known and the unknown were often blurred. The hospital where the strange events took place in 1907 was a product of this complex blend of modernity and tradition. Built in the early years of the 20th century, it was designed to reflect the latest in Western medical thinking, with its clean lines, orderly wards, and reliance on technology. However, its location was far from conventional. The hospital had been constructed on land that had a long and mysterious history. Ancient legends spoke of spirits that haunted the area, and it was said that the land had once been the site of a temple dedicated to forgotten gods. Some believed the land was cursed, and that the spirits of the past still lingered, waiting for their chance to reassert their presence in the world of the living. Whether or not the hospital's location had anything to do with the events that would unfold there in 1907 remains unknown, but it certainly added an air of intrigue to the already mysterious circumstances. At the time, the medical community was still in its infancy when it came to understanding the intricacies of sleep and the human mind. While sleep disorders were beginning to be recognized, the field was far from developed. The concept of dreams and their meaning was largely unexplored, and there were no established scientific frameworks to explain why people had certain dreams or how they were connected to the unconscious mind. In fact, the science of sleep was still very much a nascent field, with few doctors or researchers having a clear understanding of what happened in the mind during sleep. Theories about dreams were often speculative and unproven. Some doctors believed that dreams were simply the mind's way of processing the day's experiences, while others suggested that dreams had deeper psychological or spiritual meanings. However, none of these theories could explain the phenomenon that was taking place in the hospital wing in Kyoto. The hospital staff, initially skeptical of the reports from patients, began to take the matter more seriously as more and more individuals came forward with eerily similar stories. What started as a handful of isolated reports quickly grew into a pattern that could not be ignored. Patients who had no previous connection to each other, who came from different parts of the country, different social classes, and different walks of life, all began to experience the same disturbing dreams. The more the doctors tried to rationalize the situation, the more baffling it became. There was no obvious explanation for the phenomenon. Some patients had been admitted for routine medical procedures, while others were being treated for serious illnesses, yet all of them were experiencing the same terrifying visions. The nature of these dreams only deepened the mystery. They were not random, fleeting nightmares that disappeared upon waking. These dreams were consistent, vivid, and detailed. Each patient described seeing the same figures, the same landscapes, and the same unsettling symbols. Some described vast, shadowy forests with figures that lurked just beyond their vision, while others spoke of ancient, crumbling temples where they could sense an oppressive, malevolent force. The dreams were not mere fragments of subconscious fear. They were full, coherent narratives that seemed to follow a specific structure. The patients reported waking up in a state of profound fear and disorientation, as though the dreams had a tangible, physical weight that followed them into the waking world. At first, the doctors tried to attribute the phenomenon to psychological factors. Could it be that the stress of being in a hospital setting, coupled with the trauma of illness, was causing these patients to have shared dreams? Was it possible that the hospital environment itself, with its sterile, impersonal atmosphere, was triggering some form of mass hysteria? Perhaps it was an extreme case of suggestion, patients hearing others speak about strange dreams, and then unconsciously adopting those ideas themselves. But as more and more patients came forward with identical reports, it became clear that the explanation was not so simple. The more the doctors dug into the phenomenon, the more they realized that the shared nightmares could not be easily explained by psychology alone. There had to be something more at play. And yet, despite all their research, none of the conventional explanations seemed to fit. Was it possible that the hospital's design or its location had something to do with it? Some began to wonder whether there might be an environmental factor at work. Could the building's construction materials, or perhaps its proximity to certain energy sources, be influencing the patient's dreams? Was there something in the air, or in the very structure of the hospital itself, that was causing these strange visions? Others wondered if the patient's illnesses had any connection to the phenomenon. Could the drugs or treatments being administered have triggered some sort of psychological reaction that manifested as shared dreams? Despite their best efforts, the doctors were unable to find any concrete answers. The mystery deepened with each passing day, and the ward itself began to take on an eerie, unsettling quality. As the story of the strange dreams began to spread, local folklore and superstitions started to influence the medical staff and the patients. In Kyoto, as in many parts of Japan, the belief in spirits, curses, and the supernatural was deeply ingrained. Could the shared nightmares be connected to the spirits said to haunt the land where the hospital stood? Some of the local people believed that the hospital had been built on sacred ground, and that the dreams were a manifestation of the spirit's anger at the intrusion. Others speculated that the patients were being haunted by the restless souls of those who had once lived on the land, perhaps the very spirits who had once inhabited the temple ruins that lay beneath the hospital's foundation. For many, this supernatural explanation seemed just as plausible as any medical theory. Despite the widespread speculation, the true cause of the phenomenon was never determined. Over time, as more patients were moved to other parts of the hospital and the nightmare cases gradually ceased, the mystery faded from public view. The hospital wing was eventually repurposed, and the strange events that had once gripped Kyoto were relegated to the annals of the city's darker history. But for those who lived through it, the experience remained a haunting memory, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown, the scientific from the supernatural. The hospital wing in Kyoto where the strange phenomenon took place was not particularly notable in its appearance, but it was in this unassuming space that something far more sinister began to unfold. The ward, constructed as part of the hospital's broader expansion at the turn of the century, was designed to be a place of healing, a modern space that reflected the cutting-edge advancements of Western medicine. However, it became the center of a mystery that confounded both doctors and patients alike. This wing was built with practicality in mind: plain white walls, rows of simple iron-framed beds, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light, creating a sterile and efficient environment for treatment. Yet, for reasons that would never be fully understood, this very place became the setting for one of the most bizarre and unsettling events in the history of the hospital. In the beginning, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The wing was simply a part of the larger hospital, designed to house patients who required long-term care or recovery. The hospital itself was not particularly large by modern standards, but it was well equipped with the latest in medical technology for the time, and the ward was considered a standard facility for treating a variety of ailments. Patients who were admitted to this wing were typically dealing with either chronic conditions, recovering from surgeries, or undergoing extended treatments that required close monitoring. Everything appeared normal at first, until the nightmares began. The first reports came in quietly, almost as if they were dismissed as nothing more than the normal anxieties that came with hospitalization. A patient might mention a disturbing dream, but it wasn't until several more patients, from different backgrounds, different ages, and with entirely different conditions, began to describe the same terrifying experience, that the staff realized they had something far stranger on their hands. The recurring nature of these nightmares was unlike anything anyone had encountered. The patients began to speak to one another, and that's when the eerie consistency of their dreams became apparent. They were not simply experiencing different dreams that could be interpreted in various ways. These dreams were nearly identical, down to the finest details. At first, the hospital staff tried to rationalize what was happening. Was it a coincidence? Could there be some psychological explanation that tied these seemingly unrelated patients together? Doctors speculated that stress, illness, and the unfamiliar environment of the hospital might be influencing the minds of their patients, triggering shared experiences in their dreams. After all, hospitals had long been associated with feelings of anxiety and vulnerability. Patients who were sick, isolated from their families, and subject to the physical and emotional strain of their conditions could certainly experience heightened dreams. But the fact that the dreams were so similar, so specific in their content, made this theory increasingly untenable. The nightmares themselves were disturbingly vivid. They were not fleeting, fragmentary dreams that could be brushed off with the morning light. These were dreams that felt real, dreams that left patients waking up in cold sweats, their hearts racing with fear. The content of these dreams was remarkably consistent across the board. Many patients spoke of seeing dark, forbidding landscapes, deep forests that stretched on endlessly, shadowy figures that moved just at the edge of vision, and an overarching sense of dread that permeated every moment. Others described temples, ancient and decayed, whose broken walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The patients often reported feeling a sense of oppression, as if something malevolent was watching them as they slept, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Some spoke of figures they couldn't quite make out, faces half obscured by shadow, but whose presence was undeniable. There was always an overwhelming feeling of being trapped, with no escape from the ever-looming threat that these dreams promised. What was most disturbing, however, was the shared nature of these visions. It was as if these patients were all seeing into the same dark world. They saw the same figures, the same locations, and even the same events unfolding. Some described the feeling of being pulled into the dream, as if they were no longer passive participants but active players in this strange and terrifying reality. This wasn't simply a case of people having similar nightmares due to shared anxieties or conditions. This was something far more extraordinary. The more the doctors and hospital staff tried to investigate, the more questions arose. What could possibly explain such a phenomenon? Was it possible that the hospital itself was somehow influencing the patient's dreams? The wing was relatively new, and the architecture was modern for its time, but there were no obvious physical explanations. The location was not in an area known for environmental anomalies like earthquakes or electromagnetic disturbances that could trigger hallucinations. Nor were there any toxins in the air or chemicals in the building materials that could be linked to the symptoms. The idea that something about the very structure of the hospital could be influencing the patients' minds began to gain traction among some of the more open-minded doctors. But still, the explanations remained elusive. As word spread, some of the patients and hospital staff started to suspect something more supernatural at play. Kyoto, as a city deeply rooted in tradition, had its own rich tapestry of myths and legends. There were stories of cursed lands, restless spirits, and ancient temples where dark rituals had once taken place. Some believed that the hospital had been built over sacred ground, and that the dreams were the result of some kind of spiritual disturbance, a curse that had been unknowingly triggered by the hospital's construction. This theory, though unprovable, began to take root among some of the local community. The fact that the hospital was situated in an area known for its ancient temples and religious significance only added fuel to this idea. Could it be that the patients were being haunted by spirits or gods whose domains had been disrupted? Others speculated that there was something more psychological at play, an element of mass hysteria, perhaps, where the suggestion of a shared experience became enough to make it real for those affected. But this idea too was flawed, for the phenomenon did not spread like a typical case of hysteria. It wasn't contagious in the usual way. While it is true that patients began talking to one another, comparing their dreams and experiences, the reports were far too specific to be explained away as mere suggestion. The patients were experiencing identical dreams with frightening precision, far beyond the scope of coincidence or suggestion. Some doctors even wondered if it might be a form of psychological contagion, where the patients' minds were subconsciously influenced by the trauma of their illnesses. Perhaps the isolation of the hospital environment, coupled with the stress of being confined to a sterile, medical space, created a perfect storm for shared nightmares. But again, this theory did not satisfy everyone, especially when the intensity and consistency of the dreams were considered. There was simply no precedent for such an occurrence. The more time passed, the more the mystery deepened. It became increasingly clear that the phenomenon was not going to be easily explained away. Despite their best efforts, the hospital staff could not find any clear answers. They had no explanation for why these patients, all from different backgrounds and experiencing different medical conditions, were having the same dreams. And the more they tried to investigate, the more the strange phenomenon seemed to defy logic and reason. As the hospital staff worked to understand what was happening, the patients themselves began to suffer. The effects of the nightmares were not merely psychological. Many patients found themselves unable to sleep, terrified that they would once again be drawn into the dark world of their dreams. Sleep became a source of dread rather than relief. The physical and mental toll of the nightmares was undeniable. Some patients became increasingly frail, their health deteriorating as a result of the sleep deprivation and the lingering fear of the dreams. Others began to lose their grip on reality, their minds fraying under the pressure of these relentless, identical nightmares. Despite all the attention given to the strange phenomenon, the hospital never found an answer. The wing was eventually closed, and the patients were moved to different parts of the hospital. But the nightmares didn't cease immediately. The patients who had been affected continued to experience the same visions, even after leaving the cursed wing. Over time, the phenomenon faded from public view, and the hospital's dark secret was buried beneath layers of time and history. The strange events of 1907 were relegated to whispers and rumors, and soon, the very memory of them seemed to fade. Yet, despite the passage of time, the legacy of the mysterious wing lived on in the minds of those who had experienced it. The inexplicable, shared nightmares remained a haunting reminder of a phenomenon that was never fully understood, an enigma that might never be solved. It was a reminder of the limits of science, of how even the most rational minds can be caught in the grip of something unexplainable, something that exists just beyond the reach of understanding. And as the years passed, the question remained, what truly happened in that wing in Kyoto, and why did it leave such a lasting, unsettling impression on those who experienced it? The reports of the mysterious nightmares first trickled in as whispers from a handful of patients, dismissed at first as the result of stress or the natural fears associated with hospitalization. A patient here and there might casually mention a disturbing dream to a nurse or doctor, and it was quickly written off as a side effect of illness, fatigue, or perhaps medication. But soon, these casual mentions turned into something far more alarming. Patients from different wards, many of them with no previous connection to each other, began to describe eerily similar dreams. At first, it was simply strange, but as the days passed and more individuals came forward, it became impossible to ignore. The consistency of the nightmares, both in their imagery and their emotional weight, was something entirely outside the realm of coincidence. One patient, a middle-aged man recovering from surgery, was among the first to report a particularly vivid nightmare. He described being trapped in an endless forest, walking for hours in a maze of twisting trees and dark, oppressive shadows. As he walked, he could sense something watching him, lurking just beyond his line of sight. It wasn't a typical fear of being chased. It was a far deeper, more primal fear, a feeling that something ancient and malevolent was always just on the edge of his perception, waiting to strike. He awoke from the nightmare in a cold sweat, heart racing, but in a state of disbelief. He had never had dreams like this before, let alone ones that felt so real. The unsettling experience left him shaken, but he was willing to dismiss it as a one-time occurrence. However, when the man spoke with other patients in the ward, he discovered that he was not alone in his experience. In fact, several other patients described strikingly similar dreams, albeit with minor variations in details. A young woman, suffering from a respiratory illness, spoke of a dark temple she had seen in her dreams. It stood at the edge of a vast, barren landscape, its crumbling stone walls covered in strange symbols. The woman was drawn to the temple, but as she entered, she could feel the presence of something ancient and angry, watching her from the shadows. She too had awoken in a state of terror, unable to shake the feeling that the temple, and the dark force within it, was still present even in the waking world. Her experience was strikingly similar to that of the middle-aged man. The only difference was the setting, the temple instead of the forest. The more they compared their dreams, the more striking the parallels became. Another patient, an elderly man who had been admitted for a routine heart condition, described seeing the same dark, shadowy figures that the other patients had encountered. The figures were never fully visible, but their presence was undeniable, looming just at the edge of the patient's perceptions. The man could feel their cold, malevolent gaze upon him, and he described hearing whispers in an incomprehensible language that seemed to be coming from all directions. These were not dreams of the ordinary variety. They were vivid, immersive experiences that left the patients with a lingering sense of dread long after they had awoken. Over the following days, more patients began to speak up, sharing similar stories. Some described vast, endless fields under a pale, sickly moon, while others found themselves trapped in claustrophobic, suffocating spaces. The emotions experienced during these dreams were almost universally terrifying. Fear, isolation, helplessness, these were the common threads that ran through every patient story. It was not just the content of the dreams that was disturbing, but the feelings they provoked. Each patient awoke with the sense that something had happened during the night, something that transcended the normal boundaries of a dream. The fear they felt didn't dissipate with the morning light. It clung to them, a constant weight on their minds. Some described the sensation of having been followed by something sinister upon waking, as if the nightmare had bled into reality itself. As the number of affected patients grew, the hospital staff began to take notice. The strange phenomenon could no longer be dismissed as a coincidence or as the product of stressed minds. The patients' experiences were simply too consistent, too similar to one another. Doctors, initially skeptical, were now forced to confront the reality that something deeply unsettling was happening within the hospital walls. There were no clear answers, no known medical conditions or psychological disorders that could explain why these patients, from various backgrounds and ages, were experiencing the same terrifying visions. This was not simply a case of shared anxiety or collective stress. This was something much darker, something that seemed to defy explanation. For many of the doctors, the idea that these dreams were the product of shared anxiety seemed plausible at first. After all, hospitals were places of fear and vulnerability. The unfamiliarity of the hospital setting, the isolation from loved ones, and the physical pain associated with illness could certainly create an atmosphere ripe for heightened emotions. But as more patients came forward with identical experiences, this theory quickly began to unravel. How could so many different people, from such diverse backgrounds and with different illnesses, all experience the same dream? Could the power of suggestion really be so strong that it could cause such vivid, shared hallucinations? The more the doctors pondered this question, the more they realized that they had no real answer. As the mystery deepened, some doctors began to consider more unorthodox explanations. One theory that began to circulate was the possibility of an environmental factor. Could the hospital building itself be influencing the patients' minds? The wing where the dreams had been most frequently reported was relatively new, having been constructed just a few years earlier, and some speculated that the building's design or location might have something to do with the phenomenon. Was there something about the materials used in the construction, or perhaps the air quality, that was triggering these shared nightmares? Some even wondered if the hospital was built on land with some sort of mystical or spiritual significance, perhaps the site of an ancient burial ground or an old temple, leading to the idea that the building was haunted. These theories were speculative at best, but as the patients' reports grew more bizarre and consistent, the doctors had little choice but to entertain even the most far-fetched possibilities. One of the more curious aspects of the reports was the frequency with which patients spoke of the same symbols and figures. There were certain themes that seemed to persist throughout the dreams, regardless of the individual's background or illness. The dark forests, the ancient temples, the shadowy figures that never quite came into focus, these were motifs that appeared over and over again. What was it about these images that seemed to resonate so strongly with the patients? Was there some kind of hidden meaning behind these symbols? Or was it simply a case of the mind taking refuge in familiar, primal images when faced with terror? The doctors also began to wonder about the emotional impact these dreams were having on the patients. Many described a lingering sense of dread, an unease that lasted long after they had awoken. For some, the nightmares seemed to follow them into their waking lives, affecting their ability to think clearly, sleep peacefully, or engage with the world around them. Some patients developed severe anxiety and insomnia, while others became withdrawn, their minds consumed by the images they had seen in their dreams. The hospital staff, too, was affected by the strangeness of the situation. Nurses and doctors who had heard the patient stories were starting to feel the weight of the mystery themselves. The more they listened to the accounts, the more unsettling the entire phenomenon became. It was as if the hospital itself had become a place of fear, a place where the boundaries between the real and the imagined had begun to blur. Despite the growing concern, no one could offer a definitive answer. The hospital had become a place where science and superstition clashed, where the rational explanations of modern medicine were unable to make sense of the inexplicable. Some patients, desperate for answers, began to seek out spiritual healers and shamans, turning to local folklore in an attempt to understand the dark force that seemed to be at work in the hospital. But even these ancient traditions provided no clarity. The mystery remained unsolved, and as the weeks passed, the strange occurrence slowly began to fade from public view. However, the unanswered questions and the lingering sense of dread stayed with the patients and the staff long after the nightmare stopped. The strange events of 1907 were buried in the annals of history, yet the enigma of that hospital wing and the shared nightmares that had haunted its patients would never truly be forgotten. As the strange occurrences continued to unfold, the hospital staff found themselves caught between the traditional medical explanations they had relied on for so long and the increasingly unexplainable events they were witnessing. Initially, many of the doctors had hoped that the phenomenon would resolve itself, that the nightmares were simply a product of stress, or perhaps a shared psychological reaction to the trauma of illness. But as the days turned into weeks and more patients reported experiencing identical dreams, it became increasingly clear that something far more complex was at play. The more they investigated, the less they seemed to understand. For the patients, the nightmares had become something that invaded every waking moment of their lives. It wasn't simply that they feared going to sleep, they feared what they would wake up to. Every night brought a new iteration of the same terror, a new cycle of fear that left them exhausted and frail. The dreams were never fleeting or insignificant. They were immersive, terrifying experiences that seemed to have a life of their own. One patient, a young woman who had been hospitalized for a respiratory condition, described the overwhelming sensation she had upon waking. "It wasn't like any dream I've had before. It's like it was real. Like I was really there. I woke up, but I could still feel the shadows. The feeling stayed with me, like something was watching me." These words echoed through the minds of other patients, many of whom felt the same lingering sensation, a heaviness that persisted even after they opened their eyes. What made the situation even more disturbing was that the nightmares were not just a collection of vague, nightmarish imagery. They were detailed, vivid experiences that seemed to be part of a cohesive narrative. For instance, one patient described wandering through a dark forest at night, endlessly lost in the dense trees. She could hear whispers in the distance, and the closer she came to them, the more she could feel a presence, something ancient, something powerful. But when she tried to turn back, she found that the forest itself had shifted, that the trees had closed in around her. She was trapped. The patient described feeling as though she could not escape, as if the forest and its dark forces had become part of her very being. And when she woke, she was convinced that the nightmare had not ended. It had simply stopped for the moment. Another patient, an elderly man suffering from a heart condition, described a similar sensation of being trapped in a dream world. His dreams often took him to a crumbling temple, an ancient structure that felt as though it had stood for centuries, untouched by time. But the man was not merely an observer in his dreams, he was a participant. He described wandering through the temple's dark corridors, feeling an overwhelming sense of foreboding. Each step he took seemed to echo in the silence, and the deeper he went into the temple, the more he could sense the presence of something ominous, something that watched him from the shadows. He could hear whispers, but they were incomprehensible. And as he reached the inner sanctum of the temple, he was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or escape. When he woke, the terror he felt was so real that it took hours for his heart to stop racing. These shared experiences became impossible to ignore. The patients were not only describing similar locations, forests, temples, shadowy figures, they were also describing the same feelings, the same overwhelming dread that clung to them long after they had awakened. No one had ever seen anything like it before. The doctors, who had spent their careers diagnosing diseases and treating injuries, found themselves at a loss. How could they explain a phenomenon that seemed to transcend the physical, that seemed to have no logical explanation? As the mystery deepened, some began to consider the possibility of an environmental factor, a physical cause that might explain the patient's shared experiences. Could the hospital's location, the building materials, or the layout of the wards have anything to do with the phenomenon? The hospital was built on land that had been used for centuries, a place steeped in history and folklore. Some of the locals had even mentioned that the hospital was situated near an old temple, one that had been abandoned long before the building was erected. Could it be that the land itself was somehow influencing the minds of the patients? Some of the more speculative doctors began to suggest that there could be an unseen environmental factor at play, a chemical, perhaps, or some sort of electromagnetic disturbance that was affecting the brain's ability to distinguish between dream and reality. Others, however, turned to more psychological explanations. Could this be a case of mass hysteria, a shared delusion that had spread among the patients? The phenomenon did seem to follow patterns typical of mass hysteria. The patients, isolated from the outside world, confined to the sterile environment of the hospital, began to feed off each other's fears. Perhaps the initial reports, innocent enough at first, had begun to snowball, with patients subconsciously influencing one another, amplifying their shared anxieties. But mass hysteria usually manifests itself in more generalized symptoms, such as fainting or hyperventilation, not in detailed, consistent dreams. The level of detail and shared imagery among the patients made the mass hysteria theory increasingly difficult to support. Then, as the number of affected patients continued to grow, some of the doctors began to entertain the idea that the dreams were not a coincidence at all. What if they were more than just random creations of the mind, more than the result of stress or fear? What if the patients were experiencing something that could not be explained by modern science? Some of the more open-minded physicians began to wonder if the phenomenon could be the result of something supernatural. After all, the land on which the hospital had been built had long been associated with strange occurrences and mysterious events. The local folklore spoke of spirits that had been disturbed, of ancient rituals that had been forgotten over time. Could the shared nightmares be a manifestation of a curse or some other mystical force? Despite the growing number of theories, no one could offer any concrete answers. The mystery seemed to defy all attempts at rational explanation. The more the doctors dug into the case, the more questions they raised, and the fewer answers they found. The patients continued to experience the nightmares, and the doctors found themselves increasingly unable to help. Some tried medication, others attempted to change the patient's environment, hoping to alleviate the distress. But nothing seemed to work. The dreams persisted, growing more intense, more disturbing with each passing night. What was most baffling was the consistency of the reports. Some patients had been in the hospital for months, others only a few days, yet all of them described the same experiences, the same landscapes, the same figures. How could it be that people from such different walks of life, with different medical conditions and different histories, were all experiencing the same visions? Was it simply a coincidence, a product of human psychology gone awry, or was there something more to it? As the phenomenon continued, the hospital administration grew increasingly concerned. They began to take measures to isolate the affected patients, moving them to different parts of the hospital or even transferring them to other institutions. But the dreams didn't stop. Some patients, even after being relocated, continued to experience the same terrifying nightmares. It was as if the very act of being in the hospital, in that particular space, had somehow triggered a chain of events that the patients could not escape from. It became clear that this was no ordinary medical condition, and the hospital staff was no longer able to provide the answers they had once relied upon. As the weeks turned into months, the strange nightmares gradually faded. The reports of the disturbing dreams slowed, and the mystery began to slip into the shadows of history. But for those who had lived through it, the memories of the hospital's haunted wing remained vivid and unsettling. The experience left a lasting mark on the patients, many of whom were never the same after their time in the hospital. Some spoke of lingering feelings of dread, as if the nightmares had followed them into their waking lives. Others were simply too shaken to discuss the experience at all. The phenomenon eventually faded from public memory, but the question remained, what had truly caused these shared nightmares? Was it a psychological phenomenon that had somehow spread through the minds of the patients, or was it something more? Was the hospital itself cursed, haunted by the spirits of the past? The answers were never found, and the mystery lingered, a chilling reminder of the limits of human understanding and the power of the unknown. As time passed, the mysterious phenomenon that had plagued the hospital wing in Kyoto seemed to dissipate, but the echoes of its eerie grip lingered. The patients who had once been trapped in a cycle of shared nightmares slowly returned to their lives, but not without lasting scars. While the most overt symptoms, the vivid dreams and nightmarish visions, had stopped, many of those affected continued to carry the psychological weight of their experiences. The question that remained, lingering in the minds of both the hospital staff and the patients themselves, was this: what exactly had happened in that hospital wing? And why did it affect so many, from different backgrounds, in such a specific and disturbing way? For the medical staff, the unresolved nature of the phenomenon haunted them. They had been unable to come up with any conclusive answers. Theories had come and gone, each one offering a new angle, only to be dismissed as the patient's nightmares continued to defy explanation. Was it a case of psychological contagion? A mass delusion? Or was it something more insidious, something supernatural? The medical community, which had prided itself on rational explanations and scientific methods, found itself stumped by this inexplicable event. The more they tried to dissect it, the more they realized they were up against something that had no clear answer, something that perhaps lay outside the realm of science and reason. Even more unsettling was the fact that the nightmare phenomenon had never truly been confined to the hospital's walls. The patients who had once been victims of these collective dreams spoke of an eerie persistence, a sense that the terrors they had faced in their sleep had somehow followed them beyond the hospital's doors. For some, the dreams would come and go, fading into the background of their lives. But for others, the impact was much deeper. Some patients reported being haunted by fragments of the nightmares, long after they had left the hospital. It was as if the shadows they had encountered in their dreams had somehow latched onto them, clinging to their consciousness. The woman who had dreamed of the Dark Temple, for instance, found that the imagery lingered in her waking hours. She could still see the crumbling stone walls, the broken pillars, and the strange symbols that had adorned the temple's interior. It wasn't as vivid as the dream, but it was persistent, a kind of mental residue that she couldn't shake. She often found herself glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see the shadowy figures from her dreams standing just behind her. And the man who had wandered through the dark forest felt as though he had never truly left it. Even in the middle of the day, while surrounded by people and sunlight, he would occasionally feel a chill on the back of his neck, as though the forest, and whatever force had been lurking within it, was just a few steps away. These persistent effects raised more questions than answers. Could the shared nightmares have left an imprint on the patients' minds that was more than just psychological? Were these dreams merely the manifestation of stress and fear, or could they have been something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of the mind? These were the kinds of questions that the doctors grappled with long after the incidents had ceased. But even as they searched for answers, they couldn't escape the nagging feeling that they were missing something fundamental, something that lay just beyond their understanding. The hospital's administration, eager to distance itself from the controversy, quietly moved to close off the wing where the events had unfolded. The room that had once housed the patients now sat empty, a sterile space that no one dared to use again. The hospital tried to sweep the events under the rug, relegating the mystery to the back pages of the institution's history. But among the staff, there was a lingering unease. The whispers of what had happened in the haunted wing didn't dissipate so easily. Nurses and doctors who had witnessed the unfolding of the strange events found it impossible to forget. The hospital had been a place of healing, of recovery, but now it had become a place of fear, a reminder of the power of the unknown. The unsettling nature of the phenomenon didn't just affect those who had been involved directly. It began to ripple through the broader community, especially among those who had heard rumors of the mysterious events. In a city like Kyoto, where tradition and history ran deep, the idea of something so inexplicable, so dark, lingering in the heart of the city, was enough to stir old superstitions. Local folklore, already rich with stories of spirits, curses, and mysterious forces, found a new chapter to add to its long history. It wasn't long before people began to speculate that the hospital had been built on sacred ground, that it had disturbed some ancient and powerful force, and that the strange events were a consequence of that disruption. As more rumors spread, stories began to take on a life of their own. Some claimed that the land had once been the site of a temple to an unknown deity, a place where dark rituals were performed. Others whispered that the hospital had been constructed over an ancient burial ground, and that the restless spirits of the dead had risen to take vengeance on those who dared to build upon their sacred land. The most fantastical stories spoke of curses, of supernatural entities that had been disturbed by the hospital's construction. Some even went as far as to say that the hospital itself was cursed, its walls soaked in the negative energy of the countless souls who had once inhabited the land. These stories gained traction, especially among those who had already been inclined to believe in the supernatural, and they helped shape the public's perception of the events. The doctors and staff who had witnessed the phenomenon never publicly acknowledged the more fantastical theories. The hospital remained a symbol of modern medicine, a place where the latest scientific techniques were employed to heal and treat the sick. But privately, many of them couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the events than could be explained by medicine alone. There were simply too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit into the neat, logical explanations they had grown accustomed to. And though the hospital moved on, and the wing was closed and forgotten, the mystery of what had happened in that space lived on in the minds of those who had experienced it. For the patients, life slowly returned to normal, but the effects of the nightmares were not easily erased. Some found themselves haunted by the experiences for years to come, never quite able to shake the images of the dark forests, the ancient temples, and the shadowy figures. The psychological toll of the nightmares was not to be underestimated. It was as if the event had left an indelible mark on their minds, one that couldn't be easily erased. They had been part of something that defied explanation, something that transcended the boundaries of reality and dream. The more time passed, the more the event faded from public memory. But the mystery remained. What had caused the shared nightmares? Was it some kind of mass delusion, a psychological phenomenon that had affected the minds of the patients? Or was it something far darker, something supernatural, a force beyond the understanding of modern science? No one could answer that question, and as the years turned into decades, the hospital wing, once the site of such inexplicable terror, became little more than a forgotten chapter in Kyoto's long and storied history. Yet the haunting question persisted in the minds of those who had lived through it. Was it really over? Had the nightmare truly ended, or was it simply waiting, just beyond the veil of consciousness, to return again? As the years drifted on and the hospital in Kyoto returned to some semblance of normalcy, the unsettling events of the mysterious wing were relegated to the shadows of forgotten history. On the surface, life appeared to resume in the usual rhythms of medical practice. Doctors, nurses, and patients carried on as though the shared nightmares of the 1907 incident had never happened. The wing itself, though abandoned, was soon forgotten by the general public, and the hospital continued to expand its reputation as a beacon of modern medicine, free from the shadow of its dark past. However, the deeper effects of the phenomenon remained with those who had experienced it, and the mystery surrounding the events lingered, stubbornly refusing to fade into obscurity. For the patients who had once occupied the haunted wing, the aftermath of their shared nightmares was not easily dismissed. While the physical effects of their conditions improved and they were eventually discharged from the hospital, the psychological scars left by the relentless terror of those dreams continued to haunt them. Some patients reported struggling with insomnia for years, their minds unable to fully shut off at night, always bracing for another encounter with the darkness. Others spoke of the lasting anxiety that lingered even in daylight, an unease that crept into their daily lives like an invisible shadow. The young woman who had dreamed of the dark temple never fully recovered from the sense of dread it had left in her heart. She could still hear the whispers in her mind, faint but ever present, and often found herself walking the streets of Kyoto, glancing nervously over her shoulder, certain that something, some force, was following her. The elderly man who had wandered through the crumbling temple in his dreams struggled to shake the feeling that the place still existed somewhere, hidden just beyond the reach of reality. He became obsessed with the idea of finding the temple, convinced that it was real, that somehow it was tied to the nightmare that had ensnared him. His obsession eventually took a toll on his health, as he spent days and nights researching ancient texts, consulting with scholars, and even traveling to distant parts of Japan in search of a temple that, according to many experts, had never existed. His family, concerned by his increasingly erratic behavior, eventually had him admitted to another hospital for treatment. Yet, even in that sterile environment, the nightmares continued to follow him. His mind remained plagued by the sense that he was not alone, that something ancient and malignant was waiting, just beyond his perception, to emerge once again. As for the hospital staff, the incident was far from easy to forget. Many of the nurses, doctors, and administrators who had witnessed the phenomenon firsthand found themselves marked by the experience, albeit in quieter, more subtle ways. They had seen the patient's fear, heard the strange accounts, and, for a brief period, had lived in the shadow of something that seemed to defy all rational explanation. Even those who were most skeptical of the supernatural could not completely shake the feeling that there had been something inexplicably dark at play in the hospital's walls. They had watched as the patient's sleep was invaded by forces they could not explain, and had listened to the accounts of dreams that were too consistent, too chilling, to be dismissed as mere coincidence. For some of the staff, the lingering uncertainty became a kind of silent burden, a question that had no answer but could never be fully erased. The hospital, like so many places of care, was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where the sick were treated and restored to health. But the hospital's reputation, tainted by the unresolved mystery of the haunted wing, remained clouded for those who had been closest to the incident. While they carried on with their work, there was always that shadow, that question of what had truly happened. Were the patients simply experiencing a shared hallucination? Or was there something more to it, something that lay just beyond their comprehension? The mystery, however, did not remain confined to the hospital or the patients who had experienced the nightmares. It began to seep into the public consciousness, partly through word of mouth and partly through the fascination of a few curious outsiders. Over time, rumors spread of the haunted wing, and whispers of strange occurrences in the hospital began to circulate in the surrounding neighborhoods. The city of Kyoto, with its rich history, centuries-old temples, and connection to the spiritual world, was already steeped in a complex web of myths, legends, and folklore. For many in the local community, the idea that something unnatural might have occurred within the hospital's walls seemed not just possible, but even probable. After all, the city had long been a place of religious significance, home to shrines and temples that had witnessed countless ceremonies and rituals over the centuries. The hospital's once pristine reputation as a center for modern medicine began to suffer in some quarters. Local stories began to circulate, intertwining the hospital's name with that of ancient curses, restless spirits, and forgotten gods. Many older residents of Kyoto, especially those who had grown up steeped in traditional beliefs, recalled stories of temples and shrines built on sacred ground that was not meant to be disturbed. These stories, passed down through generations, spoke of places where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, and where the spirits of the past could reach out to the present, sometimes with terrifying consequences. For those with an affinity for the supernatural, the events of the hospital's haunted wing seemed to fit neatly into this long-standing narrative of a city constantly balancing the living with the world of the unseen. As the hospital tried to move on, the persistent rumors refused to die. It wasn't long before visitors, intrigued by the legend of the haunted wing, began to make their way to the hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of something unusual. Some believed that the location was cursed, and that anyone who dared to step into the abandoned wing would be subject to the same strange visions that had plagued the patients. Others believed that the nightmare phenomena had left an imprint on the hospital itself, a kind of residual energy that lingered in the walls, waiting to manifest again. While most visitors left empty-handed, their curiosity fed into the growing lore surrounding the hospital. Some even reported strange sensations while walking near the abandoned wing, an inexplicable chill in the air, an eerie quiet that seemed out of place in the otherwise bustling hospital. Yet, despite the growing rumors, no one ever truly uncovered the truth behind what had happened. The medical community, for all its resources, was unable to provide any definitive answers. Was it a psychological phenomenon? A shared mass delusion? Or something more sinister, a supernatural force that had slipped into the hospital unnoticed? The mystery remained as elusive as ever. For many, the only certainty was that something had indeed happened, a profound and unsettling experience that had touched the lives of those involved in ways that no one could have predicted. In the years that followed, the hospital eventually became known not just for its medical advancements, but also for the strange, inexplicable events that had taken place within its walls. The once abandoned wing, still standing but unused, was left to deteriorate quietly, a silent witness to the events of 1907. And though the hospital itself continued its mission to heal and treat, the shadows of its dark history lingered, both in the minds of those who had lived through the nightmares and in the whispered stories that still surfaced from time to time. The truth behind the strange occurrences might never be known, but the legacy of that mysterious hospital wing would continue to haunt the imagination of those who dared to ask, what really happened in that place? As the years wore on, the haunting of the hospital wing slowly faded from public discourse, yet the ripple effects continued to linger, almost imperceptibly, in the city of Kyoto. The incident had been tucked away into the annals of forgotten history, with only the faintest traces of its eerie grip remaining. For some, it became a distant memory, a tale told in hushed voices in the dark corners of the hospital's past, rarely spoken of but never fully erased. However, for those who had experienced it firsthand, the patients, the doctors, and the nurses, the nightmares and the unsettling mystery still hung in the air like a lingering fog. Though the hospital tried to move forward, the spectre of that enigmatic period haunted the very fabric of its existence. The nurses and doctors who had witnessed the shared nightmares could not easily forget the chilling accounts from the patients. Some of the staff found themselves questioning their beliefs, wrestling with the knowledge that they had seen something that defied the principles they had spent their entire careers learning and practicing. A few of the more open-minded physicians began to speculate about the phenomenon, quietly entertaining the possibility that there were forces at work that modern science simply couldn't explain. They knew better than most that the boundaries of knowledge, especially when it came to the mind, were not as fixed as many would like to believe. Still, they kept their doubts to themselves, choosing instead to focus on their daily tasks and carry on with their work. Yet, in the darkened halls of the hospital, particularly during the late hours of the night, some of the staff found themselves subconsciously glancing over their shoulders. A strange unease began to settle over them. It wasn't an overwhelming fear, but rather an unsettling sensation that things were not entirely as they seemed. The echoes of those shared nightmares, the descriptions of shadowy figures and whispering voices, still reverberated within the hospital walls. And no matter how much the hospital administrators tried to distance themselves from the incident, there were those who couldn't quite shake the suspicion that something far darker had taken place in that forgotten wing. For the patients who had been affected, the experience was not something they could simply move on from. They had been through an ordeal unlike any other, one that had transcended the typical scope of illness and recovery. The shared nightmares had touched them in a way that left scars far deeper than any physical wound could. Many of them had returned to their lives, but they were not the same. Their sleep was restless, often haunted by the images they had seen during those fevered nights in the hospital. The woman who had dreamed of the temple continued to feel an inexplicable pull toward it. Though the dream had ended long ago, the feeling that she had been marked by something she couldn't understand never truly left her. She would lie awake at night, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, waiting for the presence from her dream to return. The elderly man, once so consumed by his quest to find the lost temple, had become withdrawn, his obsession growing as time went on. He spent his days combing through ancient texts and consulting scholars, trying to uncover the truth about the temple, convinced that it held the key to his nightmarish experience. His family, unable to understand his fixation, watched helplessly as he became more and more consumed by the memory of that ancient, crumbling structure. His nights were filled with restless sleep, plagued by the shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The nightmares, it seemed, had become an irreversible part of his psyche, a dark imprint on his mind that refused to fade. Despite the passing of time, the memories of the shared nightmares persisted, and it wasn't just the patients who felt their lingering presence. Some of the hospital staff, those who had been the closest to the patients during that strange and terrifying time, continued to carry the weight of the event with them. Nurses who had once cared for the affected patients found themselves disturbed by the same sense of unease that had haunted the patients themselves. Though they never experienced the nightmares firsthand, many of them felt as though something had changed within the hospital during that time. The air seemed heavier, the corridors more oppressive. They couldn't explain why, but it was as though the space had absorbed the fear and anxiety of the patients, the lingering energy of the shared terror. The whispered stories and hushed conversations around the water cooler became more frequent, with each retelling of the events somehow making the hospital feel less like a place of healing and more like a repository of old, unsolved mysteries. Despite the growing sense of unease, the hospital continued to operate as it always had, treating the sick, performing surgeries, and offering care to the people of Kyoto. It was a well-respected institution, known for its modern facilities and progressive approach to medicine. But there was always that undercurrent of something darker, something unexplained, that seemed to run just beneath the surface. Visitors to the hospital, especially those unfamiliar with its history, could not know the strange weight the place carried, how the air inside that wing seemed to hum with some unseen energy, how the walls themselves seemed to hold secrets they were reluctant to reveal. The once pristine reputation of the hospital had been irreversibly altered, not by the facts of the case, but by the sheer strangeness of the events. The patients, the staff, the legends, all became part of a collective memory that refused to be fully understood. As the city of Kyoto moved forward, so too did the legends surrounding the hospital. The event of the shared nightmares grew into a modern myth, passed down by word of mouth and fueled by the curiosity of those who had heard the stories.